It all started a year ago, just after my wife Jessica and I got married. We had decided to buy a house in the suburbs, thinking that it would be the perfect peaceful place to build a life together. A quiet neighborhood, friendly neighbors, the smell of freshly cut grass, and the gentle chirping of crickets in the evening. Everything seemed ideal, but I couldn't have been more wrong. The day we moved in was exhausting. I dropped a heavy box onto the floor with a loud thud and turned to Jessica, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "Oh my God," I said, breathless. "We should have just hired movers, or at least called our families to help." She laughed, though I could see she was just as tired. "You're probably right," she replied, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. Her face was flushed, strands of hair clinging to her forehead. But there was a light in her eyes, an excitement that matched my own. Despite our exhaustion, we finished unpacking the night, eager to sleep in our new home. That night, as I drifted off, a strange sensation came over me. Suddenly, I was standing in a room bathed in crimson light. The walls, the floor, even the air, it seemed to pulse with a deep, unsettling red. It was a dream, yet felt unsettlingly real. The silence was oppressive, heavy, like a weight on my chest, until a piercing shriek cut through the air. The sound seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere, growing louder with each step I took. I stumbled through the thick, suffocating atmosphere, each movement more difficult than the last. Finally, I found a door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, desperate to escape, but the moment I turned, I was ripped from the dream. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding. I glanced at the clock. I'd only been asleep for 10 minutes. How could this dream have started so quickly? It felt like I'd been trapped in that room for hours. The following morning, the memory of the dream lingered, vivid and sharp. I couldn't shake it. I couldn't stop thinking about that horrible red light. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the stress of moving. But that night, the same nightmare returned, the shrieking noise louder and oppressive bright red light. This time I woke up feeling nauseated, my skin clammy. I went to work the next morning in a haze, thoughts plagued by the cursed red room. By the time I returned home, I was ready to tell Jessica. When I finally worked up the courage to explain the dream, she looked at me, her face a mask of shock. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been having the same dream." I stared at her, mouth dry, heart pounding. "Are you serious?" She nodded, her pale face. "Every night since we moved in, the red room, the screaming, it's the same." A chill ran down my spine. How was that possible? We decided to book an appointment with a dream psychologist, though the appointment wouldn't be for another week. In the meantime, curiosity got the best of us. We decided to check out the basement, something we hadn't fully explored yet. As we ventured down, the dim light barely illuminated the steps, casting long shadows that seemed to cling to us. And then we saw it. A door hidden behind a stack of old boxes. My pulse quickened. "Should we go in?" I asked, voice trembling. Jessica swallowed, her eyes reflecting equal parts fear and excitement. "Let's do it." The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through. The air grew colder with each step. Eventually we reached the end and found ourselves standing in a room that looked eerily familiar. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everywhere was painted in the same oppressive red from our dreams. It was as if we'd stepped into the nightmare itself. This is it," I whispered, feeling a lump from my throat. "They never showed us this room." Jessica's face was ghostly pale as she nodded, her voice shaky. "It looks exactly like the room from my dreams." Suddenly, one of the paintings on the wall began to shift, its colors distorting as though alive. Jessica screamed, grabbing my arm. "It's moving!" I looked over for a split second. I could have sworn the figure in the paintings was writing, its face twisted in agony. I felt an overwhelming urge to run. "Let's get out of here," I said, pulling her toward the door. We fled to the park nearby, desperate for fresh air, for anything that would erase the image of the red room out of our minds. That night I didn't have the dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Over the next few days, things got stranger. I began seeing figures, distorted, misshapen faces that seemed to appear in the corner of my vision, then vanish the moment I turned to look. These faces were the same ones from the painting in the red room. They haunted me, lingering from the edges of my mind, depriving me of sleep. I was constantly on edge, feeling sick and restless. Jessica was suffering too. She grew pale and distant, her once bright eyes hollow. She admitted that she'd been seeing the same twisted figures, and we both started questioning our sanity. Part of me wanted to leave and run as far away from the house as possible, but something kept us there, a dark compulsion that neither of us could explain. When we finally met with the dream psychologist, she listened carefully, her face neutral. Shared experiences, close emotional bonds, or similar mental state might lead you to have similar dreams, she suggested. Your subconscious minds could be processing that information similarly, creating dreams that feel predictive. But I knew in my gut there was something far more sinister at play. This wasn't just a shared nightmare, something supernatural was at work. Jessica and I decided to confront whatever was lurking in that room once and for all. We returned to the basement, and as soon as we entered the Crimson Room, the familiar shrieking noise filled the air. The paintings began to move, their twisted faces stretching, their eyes filled with unspeakable torment. One by one, the figures began stepping out of the frames, materializing in front of us. Broken and twisted, their voices wailing in anguish. They didn't attack, they merely watched us, their bodies folding in on themselves as they wept. Then, as if the air itself was splitting open, a shadow figure emerged, a ghost, a demon, I couldn't tell. Its voice was like shattered glass grinding against stone, speaking in a language that seemed to slice through my mind. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. Jessica, however, snapped out of it first. She grabbed my arm and screamed, "We need to go." She dragged me out of the room and into the kitchen. Suddenly she began turning the oven on, frantically cranking the knobs. "What are you doing?" I yelled, trying to pull her away, but she swung a frying pan, narrowly missing my head. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice wild. "We have to destroy it." A strange compulsion pulled me back towards the red room, but Jessica was relentless, dragging me outside as the flames began to engulf the house. As we stood in the yard, the building began to burn from within. I heard a piercing, otherworldly scream, as if the house itself was alive and suffering. We stayed in a motel that night, eventually moving to an apartment in the city. But the nightmare didn't end. Jessica became more and more disturbed, plagued by visions of the figures of the Red Room. Her sanity unraveled until one day she attacked someone on the street and was committed to a psychiatric hospital where she remains. Now, 2 years later, I'm telling this story because I've started seeing things too.